Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. KHALID MALIK, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL, has more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities. Now in a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at
Ferdinand de Saussure, founder of modern linguistics. Introduction. Ferdinand de Saussure, born on the 26th of November 1857, was a Swiss linguist. His ideas laid a foundation for many significant developments in both linguistics and semiology in the 20th century. He is widely considered one of the founders of 20th century linguistics and one of two major founders, together with Charles Sanders Peirce, of semiotics or semiology. Saussure had a major impact on the development of linguistic theory in the first half of the 20th century. His two currents of thought emerged independently of each other, one in Europe, the other in America. The results of each incorporated the basic notions of Saussure's thought in forming the central tenets of structural linguistics. According to him, linguistic entities are parts of a system and are defined by their relations to one another within said system. The thinker used the game of chess for his analogy, citing that the game is not defined by the physical attributes of the chess pieces but the relation of each piece to the other pieces. The Swiss linguist is widely considered to be the founder of modern linguistics. He emphasized the arbitrary nature of the sign, created through the association of a phonological sound, signifier, and a concept, signified. Saussure developed structural linguistics, based on the notion of the value of the sign-signifier relationship, i.e., the interdependence of other items in the language which delimit the meaning of one particular sign, and the organizational principles of syntagmatic relations, strings of signs, and paradigmatic relations, sets of signs. His work later influenced Bloomfieldian or American structuralism, and through this school, foreign language teaching methods such as the audiolingual method. Introduction. In many different parts of the world, many different languages are used by different cultural groups of people. These can be referred to as a linguistic view. Linguistic can be described as the scientific study of language, how it is acquired, how the specific language is used in the formation or production of words, and it can even change over time. Linguistics. What is linguistics? 2016. Ferdinand de Saussure is said to be the father of modern linguistics. Therefore, in this essay, Saussure's ideas and main contributions to modern linguistics would be discussed, and specific references would be made on the three main contributions, i.e. distinguishing between synchronic and diachronic, parole and langue, and signifier and signified. Another contribution we would look into is the relationship between the syntagmatic and paradigmatic, Hassan, 2009. In the field of linguistics, many different linguists shown more content. At first he distinguished between synchronic and diachronic, parole and langue is the second to be distinguished, and lastly is between signifier and signified. His contributions not only were these three key directions, but also he again contributed by describing the distinction between syntagmatic and paradigmatic, which is referred to as the theory of associative value. He pointed the difference between historical linguistics and the state language at any time. This determined him to define the focused closure of the study of language. Major contributions. Credited with establishing modern linguistics, Saussure was one of the founders of structuralism. At a very young age, he applied principles of structural analysis to solve a problem concerning the reconstruction of the Indo-European language family. Saussure's great insight was that the relation between sound and meaning is arbitrary, and that all languages are structured in a fundamentally similar fashion. His work had a huge impact on linguists in Europe and North America. Other linguists of the time generally conceived of languages as a way of denoting things and actions. Saussure argued that it is not things, but our conception of things, actions, and ideas, that are part of our language, not names, but schemas in the brain capable of being evoked by certain combinations of sounds. In one of his last lectures, he introduced the terms signifiant, signifier, for the acoustic image, and signify, signified, for the concept. He avoided neologism in general, but this appeared to be the best way around the temptation to imagine, for example, the signify corresponding to sheep as either a physical animal or a mental image of such an animal, rather than as a value generated by its difference from lamb, goat, ewe, mutton, and so on. The origins of structuralism connect with the work of Ferdinand de Saussure on linguistics, along with the linguistics of the Prague and Moscow schools. In brief, Saussure's structural linguistics propounded three related concepts. Saussure argued for a distinction between langue, an idealized abstraction of language, and parole, language as actually used in daily life. He argued that the sign was composed of both a signified, an abstract concept or idea, and a signifier, the perceived sound, visual image. Because different languages have different words to describe the same objects or concepts, there is no intrinsic reason why a specific sign is used to express a given signifier. It is thus arbitrary. Signs thus gain their meaning from their relationships and contrasts with other signs. As he wrote, in language, there are only differences without positive terms. In sociology, anthropology, and linguistics, structuralism is the methodology that implies elements of human culture must be understood by way of their relationship to a broader, overarching system or structure. It works to uncover the structures that underlie all the things that humans do, think, perceive, and feel. Alternatively, as summarized by philosopher Simon Blackburn, structuralism is the belief that phenomena of human life are not intelligible except through their interrelations. These relations constitute a structure, and behind local variations in the surface phenomena there are constant laws of abstract culture. Saussure introduced structuralism in linguistics, marking a revolutionary break in the study of language, which had till then been historical and philological. In his course in General Linguistics, 1916, Saussure saw language as a system of signs constructed by convention. Understanding meaning to be relational, being produced by the interaction between various signifiers and signifieds, he held that meaning cannot be understood in isolation. Saussure illustrated this relationality of language with the terms paradigmatic axis of selection and the syntagmatic axis of combination. Further, he challenged the view of reality as independent and existing outside language and reduced Tang Cage to a mere naming system. He questioned the conventional correspondence theory of meaning and argued that meaning is arbitrary, and that language does not merely reflect the world but constitutes it. The binary oppositions. Saussure's theory is based on binary oppositions or dyads, i.e., defining a unit in terms of what it is not, which give rise to oppositional pairs in which one is always superior to the other. The most fundamental binary opposition is related to the concept of sign, the basic unit of signification. In Saussure, the previously undivided sign gets divided into the signifier, the sound image, and the signified, the concept. Saussure stressed that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is conventional and arbitrary, and that both terms are psychological in nature. There is no one-to-one relation between the signifier and the signified. For instance, the sound image, tree, may refer to different kinds of trees, or it may even be a metaphor for the forest. Therefore, the second binary opposition is that of the langue and parole, where langue refers to language as a structural system based on certain rules, while parole refers to an individual expression of language. The terms langue and parole are parallel to the terms competence and performance formulated by Chomsky. The binary opposition of synchronic and diachronic refers to the study of the structure and functions of language at a particular point of time and over a period of time respectively. Paradigmatic and syntagmatic axes refer to the axes of selection and combination respectively, where syntagmatic denotes the relationship of units or words in a linear pattern, while paradigmatic axis constitutes of the interchangeable units in a language. It is inferred that meaning is arbitrary and unstable. For example, Saussure uses tree as an example, with the Latin arbor. Saussure's theory states that the sound image, the arbor, is arbitrary. Without the concept, it doesn't work. This is valid when looking at different languages. To a non-Latin speaker, arbor means nothing. Combined with the concept, an image of a tree, or a tree in front of you, it becomes a sign. The point he is making is that language itself is actually arbitrary. It is the associations or concepts we assign to words that hold the meaning, the signs. Without these meanings, words would represent nothing. Legacy. Saussure's course in general linguistics proved to be of seminal influence in various fields such as anthropology, Levi Strauss, semiology, Roland Barthes, the literary and philosophical concepts of Derrida, Marxist analysis of ideology by Althusser, psychoanalytical theories of Lacan, an analysis of language conducted by feminists like Kristeva, Sixus, Irigaray. Saussure's status in contemporary theoretical linguistics, however, is much diminished, with many key positions now dated or subject to challenge, but post-structuralist 21st century reception remains more open to Saussure's influence. His main contribution to structuralism was his theory of a two-tiered reality about language. The first is the langue, the abstract and invisible layer, while the second, the parole, refers to the actual speech that we hear in real life. This framework was later adopted by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who used the two-tiered model to determine the reality of myths. His idea was that all myths have an underlying pattern, which forms the structure that makes them myths. These established the structuralist framework to literary criticism. Saussure's course in modern linguistics. Saussure's glance at the history of linguistics. Saussure first takes a bird's-eye view of the field of linguistics. He sees the field as progressing through a number of stages, 3 of them older and 1 current. These stages are: traditional grammar. Essentially, the logic-based analysis of languages, primarily for prescriptive purposes. Saussure includes under this rubric every European linguistic tradition from the Greeks to the end of 18th century, when French grammar was ascendant. Classical philology. The close study of written texts of antiquity to understand literature and culture of the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Comparative philology. The discovery and illumination of historical relationships by comparison, genetic classification of languages, and by the mid-19th century, reconstruction. Linguistics proper. Begins essentially with the neo-grammarians and was the contemporary modern-day approach in Saussure's time. There were still representatives of all 3 of the earlier traditions around, however. As in all the preceding periods, although he doesn't mention it, the focus right up to Saussure's time was squarely on morphology. Syntactic patterns and problems were sometimes treated, as in Delbruck's volumes on the syntax of the Indo-European languages, but morphological patterns were considered the heart of language, and certainly of reconstruction, due to the structure of the Proto-Indo-European word. Saussure states what he sees as the basic problems of comparative philology. The scholars, according to de Saussure, had no real historical sense. They had strange ideas about language change due to their fixed belief that languages progress or decay. Specifically, the early comparativists thought that ancient languages went through stages of development, and then after that, the languages began to decay, and modern languages are essentially degenerate versions of earlier ideal structures. We saw the neo-grammarians in the Osthoff and Brugmann article making the same complaint about the same early period of comparative linguistics. These scholars fail to understand how language typological facts relate, or don't relate, to language classifications and the ways the languages got to the way they are now. The present systems need not directly correspond even though the etymological units do. In effect, they did not understand the relation between typological and genetic classifications and the historical basis of each. Diachronic typology did not develop until Greenberg. Saussure wants to focus on a different set of dissatisfactions he has with the study of linguistics, however. He makes it clear that stage 4, although representing true linguistics, is still in his view not a proper science of language. Despite their breakthroughs and move toward a more scientific methodology in reconstruction, the neo-grammarians never addressed the fundamental problem of what language is. What follows in the course is Saussure's contribution to understanding the nature of language, and the kind of field linguistics needs to be if it is to be scientific, realistic, and if it is to advance as a discipline. Saussure's view of what linguistics should be. Here Saussure outlines what he sees as the proper scope of linguistics. It includes genetic classification, historical description, and reconstruction for all languages. Discovery of universal forces shaping language, generalization beyond historical peculiarities. Definition of linguistics as a field, delimitation of its subject matter, relation to other fields. The neo-grammarians, of course, focused their attention on the first goal. Osthoff and Brugmann, 1878, had made the point that no languages were superior to others in bringing historical evidence to bear on Indo-European. The modern dialects should be studied as much as the ancient languages. Saussure's idea was just as uniformitarian, but was no longer pointing just towards the sameness of historical processes. His implication seems to be modern: no languages should be studied because we prefer their cultures, while others are left out, due to the lower social status of their speakers. The second aim in the list points toward the search for generalization, which is the hallmark of any science. The neo-grammarians certainly did attempt to generalize. Their aim was historically accurate generalizations of the processes of change that led from the parent language to the ancient written languages to, ideally, but hardly in practice, the modern languages. Furthermore, the founders, at least, made strong general claims about the exceptionless nature of sound change, and how it interacted with analogy. Still, many linguists, looking back to Saussure's day, find that the state of linguistics then seemed to have become hopelessly particularistic. As indicated above, it seemed like there were enormous lists of facts about what happened to this or that sound in Proto-Indo-European. In other words, scholars were tracing historically particular paths and not going any further in generalization than what happened in a specific language, and what order particular sound changes happened in. Saussure, I think, wanted to leave this particularism behind by ditching the viewpoint of historical paths of specific, unconnected elements like individual sounds, and turn toward something that seemed to him more important, and more real in speakers' minds, and furthermore, more connected with meaning, which certainly had gotten quite lost in the neo-grammarian program. A key point in Saussure's new way of looking at language is that everything in language is basically psychological. Page 6, so instead of the blind articulatory processes that were assumed to constitute sound change, contrasting with the psychological but irregular and heterogeneous processes of analogy, he says we have to focus on the psychological in language because that is the crucial aspect of language. Moreover, the thing that constitutes language is unrelated to the phonic character of the linguistic sign. This was a very surprising claim given that right back to Greek philosophy, scholars had assumed, as in any speaker's folk idea of language, that the forms of words were a crucial element in language. In contrast to this common assumption, Saussure tells us later in the section that the only relevant aspect of sound is the sound image, an essentially psychological and not physiological articulatory element. His purpose here is not to tell us that phonetics is useless or unimportant as an area of study, but that it is only indirectly related to the symbolic function of language, and that function is carried by the linguistic sign, an essentially psychological, now we would say cognitive, unit. The precise sounds a given sign happens to have as its sound image part are unimportant. All that matters is that it have some phonetic form that people can learn and they can call up for use in communicating. The next point Saussure addresses is the importance of linguistics. Linguistics, says Saussure, because of the universal centrality of language to human life, should be of interest and importance to everyone. But no other field, he points out, is so full of mirages, fictions, and incorrect folk beliefs. Of course we can add that this is still true today in the 21st century. Everyone considers him or herself an expert on language by virtue of knowing one. Saussure calls for linguists to try to get rid of these misconceptions and disseminate a scientifically correct view of language. This, he says, is one of the important aims of linguistics. 1. Defining language. First, Saussure tells us why defining and studying language is so hard. One reason is that the objects of study in language are not given in advance. In other sciences, the facts, the objects of study, are entities already existing prior to their observation. These pre-existing facts can therefore be considered from different points of view. In linguistics, however, the objects don't antedate the viewpoint. It would seem that it is the viewpoint that creates the object. Page 8. Worse, there's no objective way to determine which point of view, if any, is correct. No matter the viewpoint we take, he stresses, the linguistic phenomenon always has two interdependent sides, like a piece of paper. No matter what aspect of language we consider, there is some opposition of two aspects, each of which derive, its values from the other. Page 8. One example of this two-sidedness is the case of acoustic perceptions and articulatory productions. An articulated N, by itself, unperceived, is nothing. We can't reduce the unit to just its sound, or just its articulation. Both are required for it to exist as the kind of thing it is. But let's say we recognize the two-sidedness of the sound units. It turns out, he shows us, that even when you put together sound and speech as an acoustic vocal unit, it still isn't language. There is something essential missing. We have to combine the complex sound unit with an idea, a unit of thought, to form a complex physiological, psychological unit. Page 8. Yet even this is still not enough to characterize the basic objects in language. We have to consider that language has both an individual and a social dimension. Neither can exist without the other. Then, there are still two more planes or dimensions, the synchronic and diachronic. Speech always implies both an established system and an evolution. At every moment it is an existing institution and a product of the past. Page 8, it is not easy in fact to disentangle these two things. For all these reasons, it is hard to find the true object of linguistic study, without risking ignoring something fundamental. What's the solution to this conundrum? Saussure sees only one way out: forget trying to find some all-embracing science that includes all of these dimensions at once. How can we do ethnography, sociology, phonetics, philosophy, and psychology simultaneously? Instead, he says, let's study a carefully delimited thing called a language, langue, separating this essential core away from everything else relating to speech. Aspects of speech are merely derived from language in some way. Language is primary, speech is secondary. We have to always look at langue instead of language. Language, Saussure's first English translator, Baskin, translates this as human speech. But other Saussure scholars, including Harris, suggest it should be translated as human language, in general. Language in this generalized sense, according to Saussure, is many-sided and heterogeneous. It straddles many fields and kinds of phenomena: physical, physiological, psychological, both individual and social. Trying to study language or language in general, in one all-encompassing discipline, which simultaneously has to deal with all these disparate types of phenomena with no overarching aim would, in Saussure's view, lead to chaos, and indeed it did at that time, given what he saw as a confusing maze of studies that did not fit together comfortably. Langue, this is best translated as a language. I capitalize language to show that Saussure means this in a technical sense. It is not a language as ordinary people normally think of languages. For example, in terms of the folk theory of a language as a collection of names pointing to things, or considering the facts of articulation as central, which most people do. He means by langue a language in the sense of a system of linguistic social conventions. A language is unitary. It is self-contained, a whole. It is a principle of classification, in modern terms, a categorization system. It is a social product of human speech and a collection of conventions adopted by a social body to facilitate speech. It is acquired and conventional, and not strictly instinctual or natural. Humans have to learn it, unlike most of the animal communication systems that we know about. Because a language is a convention, Saussure points out, the exact nature of what is agreed on doesn't matter. This means that vocal speech and auditory linguistic perception are secondary. This was a revolutionary view at the time, but is now accepted by all linguists. The fundamentally identical linguistic nature of signed languages such as American Sign Language, British Sign Language, French Sign Language, etc., supports the idea. All these signed languages are conventional systems with conventional units, just like spoken languages except for the fact that instead of sound image there is a gesture image. Saussure says that what is natural to mankind is not oral speech, but the faculty of constructing a language, in other words, a system of distinct signs corresponding to distinct ideas. He says, beyond the functioning of the various organs there exists a more general faculty which governs signs, and which would be the linguistic faculty proper. My emphasis. So, the Saussurean sign is the basis of what for him should be the new field. It is the true object of study of the field of linguistics. Next, Saussure goes on to try to define the sign as clearly as possible. To do this he needs to separate the true realm of the sign, so to speak, from the extraneous aspects commonly thought of as essential to the nature of language, but in his view are really not. That true realm is a language, langue, a shared system of linguistic signs. The nature of the sign. Saussure discusses some apparent departures from arbitrariness, like onomatopoeia, and tells us why they do not vitiate the essential arbitrary nature of language. See Sapir 1949, for an investigation of the question as to whether there is an onomatopoeic basis to word forms designating concepts of large and small in the languages of the world. Sapir claims to have found a genuine, iconically motivated form-meaning relation. Still, he himself agreed with the notion of the basic arbitrariness of the form-meaning link. Signs as nodes in a network of contrasts. An important aspect of Saussure's linguistic signs, those conventional, socially shared, and at the same time psychological, units, is that they are defined by their position in the entire network of signs. So far this is similar to cognitive grammar's view of language as a structured inventory of form-meaning units. Langacker 1987. But Saussure also saw the essence of each sign as only its contrast with other related units. The European structuralists of the 1920s and 1930s, who were Saussure's followers, certainly treated this as a basic assumption. The implication is that a sign would seem to have no content at all, independent of its specific set of contrasting relations with other signs. It is hard to know whether Saussure would approve, looking at how semantics is now analyzed in cognitive linguistic theories. I would hope that he would recognize the need for recognizing more to the semantic side of the sign once we get past the simplest, grammatical or semantic oppositions. Mutability and immutability of language, synchrony and diachrony as two dimensions of langue. Saussure says that William Dwight Whitney was the one who first noticed the importance of the linguistic sign. But Saussure was apparently the first in linguistics, and perhaps in any social science, to claim that the structure of a semiotic system and the relations of its component parts are paramount, and that individual elements therefore take a back seat to the system as a whole. For linguistics, the effect was to make historical comparative linguistics, at that time essentially the only thing regarded as linguistics, look incredibly particularistic, because as knowledge of the history of sound changes in the various branches of Indo-European advanced, and problems of reconstruction and change were solved, the tendency was to focus more and more on individual sounds and morphemes and their trajectories through time. I believe that this focus was largely a practical matter, as it was an efficient way to organize a great deal of knowledge, but it certainly left something to be desired if one wanted to look at the forest rather than tree bark of a number of different trees, under a microscope. The comparative historical approach also made linguistics up to that point look like it was missing the essential heart of language, namely, meaning, which is of course exactly what Saussure was arguing. Comparative linguistics as developed by the neo-grammarians, and also the new fields of dialect geography whose development was encouraged in Osthoff and Brugmann's Neo-Grammarian Manifesto, both focused on the sounds of language, the form, rather than the content, of linguistic signs. The complex morphology found in Indo-European languages was, to be sure, investigated, but few linguists seemed to care much about the meaning side of the morphemes, perhaps because it was harder to state and to draw generalizations about than about the form. Both Brugmann and Delbruck did, however, discuss meaning of various grammatical categories and constructions in their work, and Brugmann in particular seems to have had very good semantic instincts. But other comparative linguists of the time tended to assume a very tight relation between form and meaning, with form expected to transparently reflect meaning, and to shy away from discussing meaning if it was not very concrete. In the course, Saussure sometimes presents synchrony and diachrony as two equally important perspectives or dimensions in language, but elsewhere in his chapters it is clear that he privileges synchrony over diachrony for understanding the nature of language, and of how speakers communicate. Saussure's structuralist followers seem to have paid more attention to such passages, and elevated synchrony to its current position as the basic dimension on which language is thought to be most appropriately studied. Diachrony was thus left as the derived, and less important, dimension, and the study of language change came to be referred to in English as comparative linguistics, comparative historical linguistics, or historical linguistics, rather than simply linguistics. Even the word philology, the older English word for linguistics, fell out of use, as possibly because it was so strongly associated with the historical dimension. In the 20th century, the study of the synchronic structural dimension of language that Saussure advocated, on the other hand, acquired the simple, unmarked name linguistics. The basic argument for the priority of studying synchronic linguistics was, and still is, that the speaker does not, in general, know the history of his or her language, nor have access to it while speaking. Saussure was the first, to my knowledge, to give this as an argument for taking a synchronic perspective. Because of these undeniable facts, he maintained that in consequence, historical information should never be mixed, consciously or unconsciously, into any linguist's analysis of what the speaker knows about the structure of the system, because if it is, it will fatally distort the object of study. Some larger issues. Why is Saussure's conception of language seen as so revolutionary? For one thing, it seems to answer an ancient question about how language is to be viewed, in a novel way. One ancient Greek school held that the forms of words, a form of a word here means a pronounced word, were intrinsically connected to the things they designated. In other words, a dog was called dog, well, kainos, because these were Greek-speaking philosophers, because there was some essence to the sound of the word that naturally belonged with its meaning. That was essentially taken as an explanation of why things had particular word forms attached to them. Essentially, we could say that this view represented a still deeply ingrained folk theory of language. This is exemplified by the anecdote of the West Country English farmer, who, surveying his pigs eating greedily and messily, mused, "Aye, rightly is they called pigs." This theory can only work, of course, if there is only one language in the world. And then only possibly work. The concepts, as well as the sounds intrinsically belonging to them, on this view, belong to external reality. Behavior. Abstractions, in other words, exist to the extent people act as though they do. In linguistics, Saussure's basic idea of langue as a humanly created and shared system of signs linguistic units, which categorize what we know, takes us straight to Bors, Sapir, and Hwerf, each of whom had his own precise take on the issue of the relation of categories of language to categories of thought. These ideas are sometimes portrayed far more extremely and less subtly than the original thinkers laid them out, so we will now begin to examine exactly what the latter three said about the relation of language and thought.
Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. KHALID MALIK, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL, has more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities. Now in a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at